Hello and welcome to Mandibil. This is part 11 of my deconstruction of Bernardo Kastrup's series Analytic Idealism. And after the last part, which was part 4, we are done with his basic presentation of his own philosophy, you could say, right? And part 5, 6, and 7 are sort of follow-up and refutations of objections and so on. And I think part 5 is about empirical evidence that supports his thesis or hypothesis, right? But you know that's a fallacious approach to metaphysics. Part 6 is the unconscious and metaphysics, or in reference to his metaphysics, I suppose. I have also skipped that one as the previous one because the whole idea is fallacious, so I'm not going to take it seriously. The unconscious is something that is based on some kind of experience, and I'm going to explain that in a bit. So therefore, talking about some unconscious and consciousness and meta-consciousness and whatever term you want to put on what comes after experience is sort of not very interesting in a discussion of metaphysics. And the last one is objections, responding to objections, which is part 7. And there are a lot of apparent, I'm not sure whether or not they are sort of official, sort of, these are well-known objections to analytic idealism or to idealism in general, or, you know, whatever, right? And I don't think I want to go through them one by one. I'll merely say, well, according to my understanding of what he's saying in these objections, he's basically using a sophist trick, which is, well, if I can point out all the others are incorrect and objections are incorrect, that means I must be right, sort of thing. Or that's the manipulative step that it sort of carries through to, right? If I have made a theory and I can sort of use some sophistry to make you believe that I'm right, and then I can, list all the objections and sort of refute them somehow, that will support that I'm more right. It doesn't do that, right? If I have a bicycle and I tell you that, well, it's not a cow, and it's not a beef burger, it's not an airplane, it's not, a sexual desire, whatever you can come up with, and therefore it must be a bicycle sort of argument, that doesn't follow, right? So there's a lot of sophistry in this presentation, right? It is basically one long conscious sort of stream of consciousness hardcore imbued with sophistry, right? You just have to, raise yourself a little above what he's trying to say and see the pattern there, right? At least that's my approach, right? And I point out some glaring problems in it, and one of the glaring problems are these general. It's very common for someone who's not trained or has honed his or her skill in judging philosophy, and whether or not it holds water, right? That is seeing the big picture of things, seeing the long lines, the long structures in what it's saying, and finding errors in the big picture rather than, okay, I'm focusing on this particular argument. Can I find something in this little argument? Try to raise yourself up a bit and look at the big picture of things, right? So what I'm saying here is like, well, just if you can refute an objection, okay, fine, the objection is not valid to refute your argument, but not being able to refute your argument doesn't support your argument, right? It's not a support of your argument. You're just sort of raising the bars for what it takes to refute your argument, right? Is this like kind of seeing the big picture of things in philosophy? That's where you can find the problems usually. It's not in the little details. They're usually pretty good and decently argued. But when you raise yourself up and say, well, it's like you can't go beyond your experiences, right? Because all you ever had are experiences, and what is derived from experiences. So how the hell can you use that to go beyond experiences, right? Because that's all the toolbox you have. You don't have those beyond experience tools. You have nothing. You have not a single tool in order to have any kind of way of describing what it might be. And even if you had some tools, it must be kind of some kind of experience-based tool. And that invalidates the tool, because that which is beyond experience, in my philosophy and in my opinion, cannot be experience, because the experience is sort of that potential derivative created in order to have at least something to work with, in order to get around in that which is not an experience, right? And that's also one of the problems. He's just extending what is going on inside him to be everywhere, as I talked about the living room in the last part, right? All my life I've been in this living room. I have an idea, if I can move towards the wall, why wouldn't there be something beyond the wall, right? And I'm philosophizing, and I'm coming up with the idea that everything outside, I know I can't go through the wall, but I'm just deciding that I know what is out there, and I'm calling that living room also, right? So I haven't brought in something new that I haven't been using before, which is experience, to transpose it into the metaphysics here, right? So I'm just saying, well, I guess everything is experience then. Problem solved. No, you're not solving anything, because you can't say anything about what is out there. And the only thing I would say that you can say about it is, if there's something you can say, if I can get to it, it is not experience, right? That's the only thing I'm willing to go with, because what I need to get around is some kind of experience. My awareness need an experience to get around. But the experience is another kind of thing than the thing itself, right? It's a different paradigm. They are not compatible. So, and if the only thing I have access to is my experience, I can use how I work and how my mind works and all the experience and abstractions and whatever. They don't function as an explanatory tool for what goes on beyond experience, or before experience, I should say, because it's not something that is beyond a sort of geographical, spatial sense. Rather, it's something that happens before. Happens is also a stretch, right? Something before, it's before experience, right? It's before experience. So if you have to have the experience of that is before, the before must be something different than the experience. Otherwise, you will have the before, right? It's difficult to put in words, and I might just jump into this one, which is a presentation I made just before I started this presentation, and I have tried to sort of simplify my idea of how things, the metaphysics, or my personal metaphysics, also in relation to Bernardo Kastrup, right? Now, what I have access to, what my awareness has access to, and I have sort of that, maybe I should present it here, right? But there's a gray box, a gray area underneath. There's a sort of the notion of axiom. Then there's a box called experience, and underneath that the five senses are mentioned, right? And then the next area, which is awareness, and that's all the rest of what is going on in mind, or my mind, right? That could be cognitions like elephant, or abstractions like brain functions, or models like atomic particle, or actions, moving my hand, right? Interpretations that could be language, emotions, my desires, and you could possibly list a few more, right? That are things that also goes on in my mind, but are not a part of experience, right? So these are other things. I think this is what he calls meta-consciousness, and while he calls experience consciousness. And that's also very confusing because he has, in my opinion, he has used 3 or 4 different kinds of terms, 3 or 4 different terms to what I call experience in this slide here, right? And I think it's a good idea to use experience as a catch-all term for the 5 senses or the qualia, right? Which is experience. It's something that is X because it points that is something that is from the outside, right? Now, it doesn't become something from the outside just because I'm using the term experience. There's nothing magical I can bring to the table by using the term experience, but it doesn't point to it. It does point to something, and that is the axiom I am using in order to make sense of my experience, right? A metaphysical sense of it, right? So if I'm working from the idea or the imagination, or maybe that's not the best term to use, but if I'm working from the axiom or stating that my hand is outside my head, well, it can't be because I must be able to experience it, right? And my experience must be in here, right? So if my hand is out here, it can't be the hand, it can't be the out here I'm experiencing. It's an experience in here which I classify as being outside. But there's nothing about my experience that must lead me to the conclusion that it's outside. So I have to state it as an axiom I'm working from. This is sort of the step away from solipsism axiom, right? And that axiom has to be stated clearly in your metaphysics, right? Otherwise, you're still working from within solipsism, in my opinion, right? That's why I put some big, letters up here, writing axiom, because the axiom is necessary for you to fabulate about your experience or your outside access, right? Now, there's nothing that says just because you have an axiom that says that your experience represents something outside. It is you cannot make the leap that your experience is the actual outside. That's the materialist fallacy, right? Because your experience must be inside your brain, right? And if you say your hand is outside your brain, well, this is not the real thing. It's not the thing itself, as Immanuel Kant would say, right? So it's a representation, it's all going on in here. I'm just experiencing it or aware of it in a way that makes me want to state the axiom that it's an outside, but it cannot be the actual outside. It must just be merely a representation of it, right? Okay, so can you go beyond the axiom and say, can I talk about what might lie before the axiom or that wall of experience, right? The experience is sort of the earliest step I have access to in this chain of events, so to say. Well, I would say, no, you can't. Because if it's an experience, it's something, it must be something different, right? That's also an axiom, right? Or at least you can say, I can't know what is there. So even if I can sort of use a very simple way of extending what I already have, my experience, backwards into that which is before experience, that is a step I cannot take, because it might not be experience, right? Just because I'm not bringing something in to explain that outside doesn't mean I can just extend whatever I have access to into that, I don't have access to. The end goal or the end conclusion is it's a no-go area. Just leave it the fuck alone, right? The axiom states there is an outside. I'm working from the idea that there's an outside, but I do not have access to the actual outside. I only have access to an experience and an awareness, which is some kind of derivative of whatever term you want to put on some kind of I'm running out of terms, right? But yeah, I've said it a few times, so you should be clear on what I'm trying to say, right? But then there's also within the mind, in my opinion, an axiom that says, you could say it's an axiom, we could discuss that, right? All the experience comes before everything else. And that might also be because that it's sort of a more complicated thing, this, right? But what is foundational to me is experience. Whatever I have of awarenesses like cognitions, elephant, or brain functions, or atomic particle, or moving my hand, all sorts of interpretations, emotions, desires, they are all traceable back to some kind of experience, right? You might have some emotion that stems from something you experienced 10 years ago, right? So, but it's still just some kind of memory or some something that has been burned into your mind, so to say, that sort of pops up now as if it came out of nowhere. But I would argue it's still something that comes from, and it might even go into generations, right? You are inheriting DNA. You are inheriting how the mind works and so on, right? You could go way back to the Cambrian explosion and even further back, maybe, right? Some of what we are carrying, like, when you have a hiccup, is it called that? When you like, right? Supposedly, they claim that goes all the way back to when you were a fish, right? When the Tiktaalik walked out of the swamps, right, onto land. So, because it has had some function in how we, oxygenate our blood, it has sort of survived. It hasn't gone away, right? So that's sort of a remnant that goes maybe 600 million or whatever, 400 million years back, right? So I can't say my hiccup was just something that just appeared because, it might be something that is sort of carried inside me in a sense, right? So that's why it's sort of complicated. But I have a sharp line between my qualia and everything else, right? The experience is what everything else is based on. And that everything else I'm calling my awareness, right? I'm aware of the cognitions that is derived from the experience, right? I'm abstracting what I call brain functions, sort of patterns or whatever, from experience. I'm making a model based on prior experience of, when I mix this with that, this happens, or the chemistry, whatever, right? And action is sort of my experiencing, rearranging themselves in certain ways, right? And you could go interpretation. Well, that sound is sort of a language and so on, right? I've been trained to understand that it's an action. That's an interpretation of an experience. Emotions come from it, might be subordinate to cognitions and abstractions and actions and interpretations. When you hear a particular word, you get triggered. When you hear whatever, right? Fascist, communist, capitalist, whatever, these political terms, then you get emotional, you get triggered, right? Okay, so the emotions, desires, and so on may lie even further back, right? And it might be necessary to even classify it further. But let's just, for the sake of simplicity here, and the metaphysical stuff, which is handling your experience and what you also have in your mind, which is not actual experience, right? So what I am proposing, the purpose of experience is how close can I get to where the experience comes from, and then no further, right? You should go as far as you possibly can, and then no further. That's where you have to look for knowledge, right? In my opinion, in my philosophy, right? So, and that might be a little tricky, right? It might be tricky to do this, right? But this is the way to do it, in my opinion, right? But it have to be well argued, right? Because there's also the experience itself doesn't give you anything, right? You can't explain the color red. What is red without going into some kind of circular argument? Well, you can't. And that's also a reason why I think this is should be treated as a reduction base, right? But it doesn't mean that color is knowledge, right? Because a lot of things, objects, can be gray, for instance, not only elephants, right? So it's like, how do you approach this? And that's sort of the whole sort of purpose of making a philosophical treatise, which is the only approach a decent philosopher should have to presenting his philosophy. You can do things like I'm doing here, and I've been talking about philosophy for I think almost 7 years now on my YouTube channel, but I'm very aware that this is not going to be what I will present as my philosophy. That is going to be my book on philosophy, which I treat kind of as a treatise on philosophy, and to some extent, I'm what's it called? What the word I'm looking for? Inspired by David Hume to some extent, right? He was not even 30 years old, and he wrote a complete treatise on philosophy, basically, right? The Treatise of Human Nature from 1739 to 1743 or something like that, in 3 or 4 volumes. I don't remember exactly, but this is the approach you should take. You can't just have a pet subject, because everything in philosophy should hang together. You can't just do metaphysics and then leave the rest alone, right? If you're sort of creating a bicycle, but you're only focusing on creating wheels, you have no real idea whether or not those wheels are going to function in a bicycle if you're not going to make the rest of the bicycle, right? That's also a problem of this kind of approach that Bernardo Kastrup has. He's not going further than his metaphysics, right? So he doesn't really know whether or not it functions, right? Because the end goal is basically a moral principle, right? You're not just creating bicycle wheels because you like creating bicycle wheels, right? It has to function with the rest of philosophy. I mean, it's a metaphor, right? But you know what I mean, right? So, what I have done is, if I can find it here, I have made a list or little timestamps, what's it called? For the various objections in his video, his objection video. Maybe I should move it up here so you can see it on the screen. Okay, I take one at a time, right? There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 sort of official objections against his approach to metaphysics. And there is the felt concreteness objection, the private mind objection, the standalone world objection, the autonomy of nature objection, the shared world objection, the natural order objection, the equivalence objection, the primacy of brain function objection, the unconscious mentation objection, the solipsism objection, the cosmological history objection, and the implausibility of cosmic inner life objection. Now, I don't know if there are more than this. Possibly there are, but I suppose this could be sufficient in order for him to sort of say, I think I'm on the right track, right? But the basics is that he doesn't heed to this axiom, right? He doesn't heed to the axiom that he's working from, there's an outside, but I cannot possibly have access to it, right? Because I'm staying within my experiences. He then attempts to do it by saying, well, then I guess everything is experience. But he can't do that, right? He can't just extend it into that which he doesn't know what it is. There are not just living room everywhere outside your living room just because you have never experienced anything but your living room, right? So that's a step that is invalid in my opinion, right? It's I don't know what the fallacy would be. Maybe you can lecture me on that, right? He doesn't identify experience as a reduction base, right? Because the first step you have in this chain is your experience, right? In my opinion. Somebody might be able to argue differently. I'm willing to hear objections, right? But in my opinion, what the first thing you have is colors or sound or smell or feel or taste. The rest is some kind of awareness of these experiences. And there's a long list here: cognitions, abstractions, models, actions, interpretations, emotions, desires, right? But they are all there because I have an experience. If there weren't an experience, I wouldn't have these cognitions, abstractions, models, actions, and so on. So when he starts to argue for whatever it is he said, he immediately steps over experiences actually, and use all sorts of cognitions, abstractions, models, actions, interpretations, emotions, and desires in order to describe that which is before the axiom. Right? He shouldn't do that. Because if he is not describing a reduction base as the experience, which it must be, right? He is confusing you so much that he says, well, all this awareness I have, these kind of tools, like little balls and little arrows and little this and little that, abstractions, I can place them back before my experience, right? And call it experience. So I don't have to bring in some expanded kind of reduction base. So he's manipulating this presentation I have here in order to say, well, I guess I solved the problem of what is behind your experience, right? It doesn't work, because whatever you have of tools, be that a cognition or an abstraction or a model, an action, and so on, they all point back to some kind of experience. And you need that in order to figure out whether or not he's bullshitting you, right? You have to be able to, okay, he's using that term now. What does that mean in reference to the reduction base? Can I say that it has a color, a sound, a smell, and so on? Okay, if it has, well, then we're stuck in the reduction base. We can't go any further. We can't reduce it any further. And if it doesn't refer to any reduction base, well, he's just farting in the wind then, right? He's not trying to impregnate you with something where you have lost contact with your reduction base. And then it should also be refuted or denied, right? So it's all one big pile of manipulation, in my opinion, right? He's very eloquent in his style and his way of presenting it, and he sounds quite convincing, I would say, right? But look for these small problems that are basically everywhere, right? So I think this is the end of my. I think I have rounded it up now, and I'm just waiting for what will happen further in his copyright infringement on the first four, or video number 2, 3, and 4. And the situation is this still. I haven't heard any further since what I told you yesterday and some days before, that YouTube has pulled down video number 3, or my part 3, but at the same time told me that part 2 and part 4 will not be taken down because of fair use policies regarding whatever it is I have done, right? So, and I have corresponded with Essentia Foundation, which I believe is Bernardo Kastrup, but he doesn't say, when he's communicating with me, he calls himself Essentia Foundation, and sort of to make me feel that I'm alone and he's a big corporation or some kind of looking down on me and potentially going to bring in these bastard lawyers in order to get me down, right? It's sort of intimidation tactic to not be personal, even though he has my personal information and my name and so on, right? He doesn't present him as a person, right? That's also a red flag of a kind, right? But I wrote back that, okay, why don't you just accept that a good idea would be to have an open discourse about these things because they are so incredibly important to get a handle on, right? And his answer was that he doesn't like that I use all the whole video in order to present my arguments. He said I could use up to half of it. And then I wrote back and said, well, why would you want me to use half of your video? So I could sort of cut it up into little pieces and take that out of context and so on. And basically, slice your argument into half or something like that. And sort of, why would you want that? Why wouldn't you want me to respect your arguments in full and reflect on them in full? I don't get it, right? I really don't get it, other than there must be some other agenda, right? This is not about philosophical discourse, right? This is sort of a preaching from up on high that says, this is how it is. I've spoken to the spaghetti monster and it has told me that it's experienced everything out there, right? And you little, congregation, my little church, you have to follow me, right? And if you don't respect me, I'm going to, ostracize you or destroy you using, the state and YouTube and whatever, right? And basically threaten you with violence if you don't comply, right? So it's not about philosophical discourse, apparently, right? It's sort of a semi-fascistic mentality around philosophical discourse, and I don't get it, right? Well, maybe I do get it, but I have no patience and no respect for that at all, right? Nothing whatsoever, right? So, and I basically stated that, well, I want him to remove the strike on my part 3 so I can have a complete discourse present on my channel that is sort of a second different opinion on his metaphysics than his own opinion and all those who sort of brown nose him, right? Because the contact I've been in with Zoom meetings or forums or discussion places and comments in YouTube videos, people who are in the fold of this metaphysics, they are all treating him like he's some kind of oracle, like he's some kind of priest. But Bernardo says it's okay, so it's okay because Bernardo says it. That's the level of philosophical rigor that the followers are, capable of, right? They basically have no, subjective, individual, philosophical tool to be skeptical about it, right? Because skepticism, to some extent, is you yourself creating your own discourse about your own philosophy, right? You are a discourse objector to your own philosophy. If you don't have that capability, you're going to be a shady philosopher, in my opinion, right? Because you can't see any faults in your own philosophy. That's why he uses terms like, it's a superior hypothesis. It's actually the only hypothesis, right? It reeks of megalomania and narcissism, right? Doesn't it? I mean, give me your comment, right? I think it does. I don't like it at all, right? So, okay, I think this is the end of my deconstruction of Bernardo Kastrup series on analytic idealism, and I think I have myself only solidified my ideas of the shortcomings of his presentation. Some of what he's saying might suffer from him not being able to argue rigidly and clearly about it. So there might be something that I haven't spotted because I am confused about his wording. But the basics is, as I tried to explain in this presentation here I've made, that he's violating his axiom, he's not defining his reduction base, and he's using his awareness and the abstractions from the awareness and cognitions and so on, instead of referring to the reduction base. He's just taking these abstractions or derivatives from the experience and throwing them back into before the experience. Right? That's why he's talking about things that can't be experienced when he's presenting what is going on beyond that experience. So this is sort of the low down and dirty critique and refutation of his metaphysics, right? He's violating his own axiom, he's not defining the reduction base correctly, and he's just throwing around abstractions and cognitions and models and actions and sort of, and throwing them into that which he can't throw anything into, because he has no tool in order to describe that which comes before experience. Okay, that's the last word in this case. See you next time. Bye-bye.